The topic is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and we're talking to Attorney Michael McDonald. Of course, Attorney McDonald, before we had our second commercial break, we promised that we'd give you an opportunity to continue this excellent discussion dealing with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I think one of the issues that we left off with had to do with the role that President Lyndon Johnson played in that, not only in that event, but the role that he played in several other very, very important acts. Let's continue our discussion from that perspective.
Okay. Well, the other thing I guess would be relevant to discuss regarding the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is the fact that it has been extended. The act passed in 1965, was extended again in 1970, extended again in 1975, and extended the third time in 1982. And each of those three extensions represented the intent of the Congress and the President at the time of each of the extensions to broaden the power and the authority of the national government over some area involving voting. Everything from extending protection to Hispanic, Latino Americans, to making sure that there wasn't what we call gerrymandering, which is where you have political districts that are carved out to benefit a particular officer or an incumbent or a particular group. That the act was extended to address those type issues. The act is also up for extension again in 2007, and in 2003 and 2004 there was an email that got a lot of circulation that basically represented that the Voting Rights Act of 1965, if it wasn't extended in 2007, would take away the rights of blacks to vote. That is not true.
Speak to that, because I think that is one of the real issues that we hear addressed during this, when you talk about the extension. Speak to that.
Sure. Again, the email and the information as far as the act not being, if it's not extended, would abridge the rights of Negroes to vote is not correct. First of all, the Congress has been consistent in terms of its commitment to extending the act. It's been a bipartisan commitment over 40, 45, 50 years. Second, even if the act were not extended, the rights that blacks have to vote is protected through the Constitution, through the 15th Amendment. 15th Amendment. The purpose of the act, the Voting Rights Act, was basically to give the Congress and the federal government the authority to come in and to basically put teeth into the 15th Amendment. And then third and finally, most states have within their state constitution some amendment which protects the rights of blacks to vote. So even if there were changes made at the congressional level, blacks, along with other Americans who have dual citizenship as national citizens of the federal government, and then the second citizenship within the state that they reside, would still have protection. So I think it's important for us to make sure that people understand that even if the act is not extended, the rights of blacks would still be protected by the 15th Amendment.
You know, one of the real issues dealing with the suffrage here in the state of Tennessee, since we're dealing with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, has to do with the state having taken the right to vote from convicted felons. And as a matter of fact, I think that was in the newspaper quite recently. And people let's speak to that, because I think that too is a part of this Voting Rights Act of 1965 in the sense that these individuals are denied suffrage. Talk about that.
Well, first of all, as I mentioned, most state constitutions address voting, and under the 10th Amendment under the federal Constitution basically says that all rights that are not given to the national government are reserved to the states. Well, one of the rights that's reserved to the states is voting. And so states have, to some degree, the right to regulate and decide who can, in fact, vote. Most states do have prohibitions, or have, not prohibitions, but basically restrictions against individuals who have been convicted of certain felonies. And as we know, black males are overrepresented in terms of convictions for misdemeanors and more serious felonies. They make up somewhere between 65 and 68% of the adult male prison population in state prisons and also federal prisons. And so the impact that these laws have on African-American males is disparate, it's disproportionate when compared to the impact that it might have on other groups. There are several different organizations, the NAACP, the ACLU, several organizations, and some moderately conservative organizations who are taking a much closer look at this and saying, what relationship does a conviction of a felony have to someone's right to vote if they've already served their time, and the fact that they've gone through the judicial process. The judicial process has already rendered a penalty for them. Is this not a form of double jeopardy? Double jeopardy, where you're saying the person is being punished again. So there, for example, in the state of Alabama, I know that there was a project where they focused in on trying to restore the rights of those African-American males who had been released from incarceration either through the probation process or some other process, and helping these individuals to go through the process of having their rights restored. In Tennessee, we had a system where, depending upon the nature of the offense that you are convicted of, and when you committed it, you could be restricted from voting. And now, the way the law is written, that it pretty much covers just about any felony. And so hopefully the legislature will take a much closer look at this. But this is not something unique to Tennessee, something that exists in all 50 states.
Well, and so this is, and even though we're talking about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we're essentially saying that this is one of those areas that is as significant now as the discrimination against other groups at an earlier period, and it's something that simply limits our democracy. Would that be?
I think that's a fair and accurate assessment. And again, the issue that's raised by many legal scholars is this idea of a type of double jeopardy. And I think there's some merit to that argument. And maybe it will get to the point where there'll be a test case brought before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will be able to
deal with that as an entire issue, not have to deal with the state by state.
State by state, which is what was avoided through the Brown decision, and what happened basically when we looked at the literacy test and poll taxes and grandfather clauses and white primaries. The Supreme Court, different Supreme Courts, the same United States Supreme Court, but different courts in different periods of time in history, from 1870 through 1964, went on record as saying those four different procedures clearly were unconstitutional and violated the due process rights of blacks.
You know, we've got about a minute and a half, Attorney McDonald, but before we end the show for today, let's have you to make some statements to perhaps some of the younger people of our generation who might not understand the significance and why their vote is important. Speak to that issue, why they ought to vote and register and vote.
Well, first of all, I think that they understand the history of the battles that were fought for blacks and women and people of color to vote. They would have a greater appreciation for its value. I think, as in so many other areas in American society, the suffrage, the right to vote, its value has been diminished. And to understand that in our democracy, in one of the strongest countries in the world, where you have the right to actually go on record and say who you want to provide leadership at different levels of government, locally, the state government and the federal government, that is a special opportunity. And the fact that we are able to vote and decide who's going to represent us, decisions that impact us. For young people, I think one of the critical issues would have to be possibility of bringing back selective service. And the idea that you have the right to actually speak to that and decide who's going to represent you in Congress, represent you in the United States Senate, and ultimately the presidency. And also helping them understand that all politics is local, and the things that happen locally that have a direct impact on them on a day-to-day basis.
Very good. And of course, Attorney McDonald, let me thank you over the last 8 or 10 minutes that we have here for bringing us that excellent information today dealing with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.